Welcome, everyone, to our live webinar 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday, June 11th, 2020. I'm Richard Gage, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing now more than 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. Last week, we presented Part 1, World Trade Center Building 7. This is Part 2, the Twin Towers Explosive Destruction, in which we'll be examining the explosive evidence and the structural dynamics of how the Twin Towers collapsed. First, let me introduce you to our operations manager, Andy Steele. Hey, Andy.
Hey, Richard. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. I just want to let everyone know that I'm here to help with any technical glitches, which will occur from time to time. Also, I'm going to be taking comments and questions at the end of the seminar. You can submit them in the questions and information form, which is online at ae911truth.org. Just go under the continuing education tab and find the live webinars. There's a box right there. It's the best way to submit them. But I'll also be looking at our Facebook page and the YouTube broadcast of this webinar to find any good comments related to the material that Richard is going to be covering today. So with all of that said, back to you, Richard.
Thanks, Andy, and be sure to check out Andy's incredible weekly podcast, 9/11 Freefall. It's free on the air. Just look for it on YouTube. Also, just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. More recently, before launching full-time into this critically important outreach effort, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. I now work full-time, educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. I was deeply moved in 2006 when I heard on the radio David Ray Griffin, who was discussing the explosive evidence, which had brought to light the 156 first responders talking about all of these explosions. These testimonies had been hidden, but finally the New York Times revealed they provided the transcripts for these testimonies, which were hidden by the city until the New York Court State of Appeals forced them to turn it over. And they did. And today we're going to be talking about the results of that. And that launched me head over heels into this project. It has become my effort. And so let's get right into it. The Twin Towers. How did they come down? Well, let's talk about the design just a little bit. Some called it the crowning achievement of the international styles. Others criticized it as heartless modernism. And we have Robert Stern, famous architect, calling it gigantic dumbness, right? You just extrude 2 squares until they become the tallest buildings in the world. Well, compare that to the beautiful unfolding massing of the Empire State Building, and which was the tallest building at the time. But what's really important is the innovations. First of all, elevator innovations, getting 50,000 occupants in each tower up to their offices and almost 100 separate elevator cabs, an incredible feat in this 3-tiered structure, which was really an important innovation. But structurally is where we're going to be looking at even more so, because prior to this the development of the Twin Towers, we had a forest of columns in these buildings, which really impacted the ability of the tenants to lay out their spaces. What they did with the Twin Towers, though, was move back half the columns to the perimeter in an exoskeleton with 3 vertical welded to 3 horizontal structural members, which were brought and erected in place with cranes and bolted together. Inside, we had a massive series of 47 incredibly dense core columns, which halfway through the structure at mid-height, they're 22 by 16 inches, and then solid steel at the base. Between these two structures, if you will, was laid the horizontal diaphragm, or the floor system, with concrete poured over these lightweight steel trusses. So this is where NIST focuses its investigation, as we'll see, on the vulnerability of these lightweight steel trusses. But design-wise, what that allowed is 60 feet of open office planning on the upper, the top of this side of the hoistways, and then on this side, and then 35 feet on the sides. So this had never been seen before in modern office skyscrapers. In the late 70s, mid 70s, this building began its effort to gain occupants. But they quickly realized that, gosh, by the early 80s, there were even more structural innovations allowing greater ceiling heights, more picturesque views of the cityscape below. Whereas here you have marching columns around the exterior every 3 feet 4 inches, these 14-inch square steel tube columns. Some likened it unto a jail cell. Also, by the 90s, these buildings were requiring already asbestos abatement required by the city to comply with federal regulations, a $5 billion project by some estimates, and greater cost for the improvement of mechanical, electrical, and communication systems in the building, which were severely outdated with the oncoming new skyscrapers of the 80s and 90s. So it was really an albatross. So 6 weeks prior to 9/11, through a process of bidding, which many researchers fault highly, Larry Silverstein ends up with owning these buildings, with investing just $125 million of his own funds, leveraging that to $3.2 billion for the purchase of all 6 of the other World Trade Center buildings. He had already built Building 7, which we talked about last week. He had developed that in the mid 80s himself. So now he owns the whole thing and puts massive terrorist insurance on it. And 6 weeks later, we have 9/11. So let's talk about what happened in terms of the theories and how soon they developed about how this building came down. Let's go back to that morning.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience. Elements of the myth: the impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
Well, here's the official story in a nutshell from Gene Corley, right? Where did he get that? Maybe from the guy on the street who had the answer right off the bat. Even though other engineers have been arguing about the collapse of these towers for almost 20 years now. But let's take a look at it here. The North Tower was hit at 8:46 in the morning. 102 minutes later is when it collapses. So a lot of people associate the impact of the airplanes directly with the collapse of the building. No, it's an hour or an hour and a half later that the buildings collapse. NIST even acknowledges, NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people. They acknowledge that the jet fuel, 90% of it, was burned up outside the building. The rest of it was just burned up in 10 minutes. It was all gone. So for over an hour after that, we have normal office fires. The jet fuel simply started the fires. And of course, the columns were broken. Jumping to the South Tower, it was hit at 9 in the morning, and it collapses just an hour later, United 175. So the South Tower was hit about 30 stories down. The North Tower was hit about 15 stories down. We generally know the North Tower from the South Tower because of the antenna. A large 300 or 400 foot antenna is up there. So there were investigations into these disasters, starting with volunteers who worked themselves right into the paid position of the FEMA team who hired them. And so these are not independent investigations whatsoever. In fact, the FEMA team, which finally got $600,000 worth of funding, but that's not much. Their efforts were quite hampered, as documented by the New York Times. Their efforts were hampered by limited access to the site. They had the FEMA refused to let them appeal to the public for photographs. They couldn't get forensic inspections. The steel was destroyed before they could get to it and do a proper investigation. So their effort was taken over in 2004 or 2002 when they produced their report, basically claiming that the building had fallen in a kind of a pancaking collapse, which NIST reversed. We'll talk about that. In 2005, the NIST report came out. They had 3 years to work on their report, and finally $20 million worth of funding, not nearly as much as Bill Clinton had used against him for the investigation of his impeachment due to his affair with Monica Lewinsky. Here we have the two worst failures in modern history, and yet very inadequate investigations, as we'll see. The theory here is that these fires, which they say were raging on the floor at the time of the collapse, were causing the floors to sag, these floor trusses, which then pulled on the core column, the perimeter columns, which caused them to fail, apparently virtually all at once, since the building, particularly the North Tower, was nearly symmetrical in its collapse. There's a problem with this theory, though, right off the bat, of course. Sagging floor trusses cannot possibly cause the enough force to pull in the 3 columns that it's connected to. So they are having to put a artificial 5,000-pound load in their computer model to force these columns to fail so that they can begin their initiation of collapse theory in their computer model. So this is what some of us call fraud right off the bat. But we go further because the fires weren't raging at the time of the collapse. They were quite diminished, indicated by the thick black smoke. These are oxygen-starved fires and cooler. So we have some real problems to uncover, and that's why we use the scientific method at AE 9/11 Truth. It's been used in the West to winnow error from truth, fact from fiction, fantasy from reality for 100 years now. We have a question. It's quite simple, actually. How do the towers come down? Well, we do some background research, make some observations. We come up with hypotheses, rational guesses is really what they are, in an effort to try to test those hypotheses with the evidence, experiments, and so forth. Maybe the jet planes were primarily responsible. Maybe it was the ensuing fires. Maybe it was explosions. Explosions are certainly a part of the evidence, as we'll see, although denied by NIST, as we'll also see. Maybe controlled demolition, for which we'll be looking at a lot of evidence, makes sense. All of the hypotheses are laid out without respect to our own personal financial or political obligations that might sway our objective opinion in the matter of whether of how these towers came down. We make predictions about those hypotheses. We test them with experiments. We analyze the results. If the hypothesis is corroborated after drawing conclusions, we report the results in an open, transparent manner. We don't hide the results or the computer input data, for example, which NIST hid, as we saw last week, and refused to give that to the architects and engineers who are tasked with ensuring that the public has buildings that are safe to occupy. Yes, that was their actual reason for not releasing the computer input data, that it might jeopardize public safety. Well, if a hypothesis is not corroborated, as we will see NIST's was not, we go back, construct a new hypothesis, make additional work to test that hypothesis until we have one that is corroborated. That's the work that we're about today. So let's start with some background research. Forces that destroy buildings. Fire is certainly one of them. It's an organic process. It's chaotic. It moves through the building in roughly 20 minutes or so in a modern skyscraper. That's all the fuel that we have to burn in a given area. This is even acknowledged by NIST. And 20 or 30 minutes in a given area, although we saw that they claimed that those fires were burning well over an hour and a half in the case of Building 7, right around column 79. If you missed part 1 of this series, be sure to check it out. It's about the 3rd tower that collapsed on 9/11, Building 7. So look for that 9/11 An Architect's Guide, Part 1, World Trade Center Building 7. Well, skyscrapers don't collapse due to fires. Not before 9/11 anyway. But wood frame buildings, they could fall over to the path of least resistance. The fuel is the structure. In skyscrapers, we don't allow that. And so if a wood frame building is going to collapse due to fire, we would expect it to fall not straight down through the intact, cold, hard structure below the fire, but to fall over if it's going to fall at all. How about steel frame buildings? What happens in fires in steel frame buildings? Well, fortunately, we have the largest test of its kind. An 8-story building was built, and for the purpose of burning it. And incredible fuel loads were stacked in, as you see on the left here. And we have some extraordinary conclusions, but let's take a look first.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently, of course, he's referring here to 9/11, when we had not 2, but 3 protected steel structures collapse due to fire. Let's see what fire does to other buildings, though, like these.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
None of them did, nor these, which happened after 9/11, fully engulfed skyscrapers with fire. No collapse. So, yet these severely diminished fires at the time of the World Trade Center Twin Towers collapse are said to have brought this building down. You can see why we're looking at this. So there's some brief research about fires. Let's look at buildings that did suffer natural collapses, in this case due to earthquakes. These buildings suffered a lateral force on them, which caused them to fall over. The building doesn't fall straight down through the path of greatest resistance. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. We recognize a building in the aftermath as a building intact, mangled, damaged badly, but still recognizable as a building. So let's set this now on the shelf, because we'll be coming back and comparing this to that set of features to the Twin Towers in the aftermath. These buildings were exploded. They have incredible quantities of pyroclastic-like clouds due to the amazing heat from the chemical reactions from the explosives, rapidly expanding these clouds in cauliflower-shaped forms against with a solid edge that's rapidly expanding. There's witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. So these features are very clearly indicative of destruction with explosives. There's pulverized building solids in the in the air. So keep that in mind. Now, explosives can be harnessed quite effectively to bring down skyscrapers in controlled demolitions, as we see here in this series of controlled demolitions. There's only a handful of companies that can accomplish these types of demolitions in the United States. It's quite a science. It doesn't happen by fire. So separating this type of destruction from fire is really not a difficult task. There's a set of features associated with this type of destruction. Let's take a look at a few of them. We have a sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the structure, not always though. And number two, we have a near straight down or fairly symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint. That's because patterned removal of column supports is taking place, something fire doesn't do, of course. And so there's a near free fall acceleration straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structure in the way. And this results also, of course, in the total dismemberment of the structural steel frame. It's shattered. There's high order damage. Feature number 6, limited damage to adjacent structures. At least that's one of the goals of typical controlled demolition. Patterned explosions and flashes of light seen and heard by witnesses. If you have these features, you know, we have explosions. Broken up concrete floors. You don't want to have to go back and jackhammer floors to break them up when explosives could have done that work quite efficiently and safely. Feature 9, explosive charges, of course, are chemical evidence of them left behind. Well, that's the next one, chemical evidence left behind in the residue. That would be obvious. Feature number 10, there's explosives going off at various floors. It's obvious that they're explosions, not part of any natural collapse. These features are direct evidence of destruction with explosives. They're not features of destruction with fire, any of them, let alone all of them. Fire can cause collapses, let's say in wood frame buildings, but they do so asymmetrically with gradual deformation following the path of least resistance. That's very different. Why hasn't a skyscraper collapsed before 9/11? Well, one reason is steel conducts this heat away from the source. It's a heat sink. And very dense. It draws that heat away, keeping the steel from ever getting to its 1200 degree Fahrenheit temperature, at which it can lose half its strength and begin to sag. We don't want that to happen. So we, and it typically doesn't, even in non-fireproofed buildings, but we add cementitious fireproofing 2 and 3 hour protection. Now that's about 4 to 6 times the protection that a building needs, because again, remember, fire only occurs in one area, even according to NIST, for 20 or 30 minutes, and then it moves on looking for fresh new fuel sources. But we keep these skyscrapers from being built out of combustible materials, and we keep the tenants from bringing fuel loads into the building beyond a certain limit. So that helps. And then just to keep all that from becoming a problem, fire, we put sprinklers in these buildings in modern times. And in the case of the Twin Towers, these sprinklers, which were installed, were said to have been damaged by the impact of the Twin Towers on the sprinkler mains. Forgive me, that's Building 7's sprinkler system, which was damaged by the collapse of the Twin Towers. The sprinkler systems in the Twin towers were said to have been compromised by the plane impacts. So, with additional circumstantial corroborative evidence, such as government documentation, it could be helpful. Foreknowledge, we know in advance when a controlled demolition is going to take place. Experts agreeing, at least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter of whether a building has been brought down with controlled demolition or not. And video documentation, all this can be quite helpful in proving whether there is a controlled demolition. That's what we're going to apply, that proof, to the Twin Towers. Let's get right into it. Is there a sudden onset of destruction? Well, starting with the North Tower, again, the antenna tells us, we have the building standing still, and then all of a sudden, the building falls smoothly, suddenly, straight down. No jolt, no impact, no hesitation at all. This is indicating that the columns, all of them at once, have given away their support. Let's go to the South Tower. Standing still, and all of a sudden, the building coming smoothly, suddenly down. No impact, no jolt, no hesitation, as columns would be expected to provide. That's a good point. We'll add that column buckling slide here for you, because what it shows is that there's 25% reserve strength even after a column has buckled, meaning bent. It's still providing 25% of its resistance, and yet there's hardly any resistance here, as we'll see. The building doesn't even slow down. Are there patterned explosions and flashes of light seen and heard by witnesses? Let's jump to the City Fire Commissioner Thomas von Eschen, who sought to preserve these accounts before they became a collective memory by recording 500 of his first responders, orally recorded. Now, they tried to keep this from, the city tried to keep this from the New York Times, but finally they were released, as I mentioned earlier. And the New York Times published the transcripts of these, and they found, well, Graham McQueen, who carefully read them all, found at first 118 firefighters observing flashes of light, sounds of explosions, and other phenomena of explosive demolition. Now, this is extraordinary evidence that didn't even come about until August of 2005, which is after which David Ray Griffin did his presentation on this subject, which I heard an interview of on KPFA's Guns and Butter program with Bonnie Faulkner in the San Francisco Bay Area here. Well, let's look at a few of these. What are they saying? We felt the ground shake. You could see the towers sway, and then it just came down. All of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. Felt like a train running under my feet. The next thing we know, we look up and the tower is collapsing. Now, again and again, you're going to hear this order of events, which is very distinctly described, fortunately, by these professional experts in their field. They're describing an order of events. Before the building collapses, they're hearing these explosions. It shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking. I heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. An explosion appeared at the very top simultaneously from all four sides. Materials shot out horizontally, and then there seemed to be a momentary delay before you could see the beginning of the collapse. There was an explosion in the South Tower, one floor under another. When it hit about the fifth floor, I figured it was a bomb because it looked like a synchronized, deliberate kind of thing. Seemed like on television when they blow up these buildings, seemed like it was going all the way around like a belt, all these explosions. Let's see what they're talking about. Take a look at the North Tower on the right compared to a known controlled demolition on the left. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a skyscraper? Probably should have been the first hypothesis seriously considered before fire. But no, it was relegated to a series of very frequently asked questions that NIST published only years later after their report came out. You ever see professional demolition where they set charges on certain floors and then you hear pop, pop, pop? When I heard that friggin' noise, that's when I saw the building coming down. Somewhere around the middle of the World Trade Center, there was this orange and red flash coming out. Initially, it was just one flash. Then this flash kept popping all the way around the building, and that building had started to explode. I saw a number of brief light sources being emitted from inside the building between floors 10 and 15. He saw about 6 of these brief light flashes accompanied by a crackling sound before the tower collapsed. I saw low-level flashes. Flash, flash, flash. And then it looked like the building came down. The building was blowing out on all 4 sides. We actually heard the pops. You know, you heard the pops of the building. With each popping sound, it was initially an orange, and then a red flash came out of the building. Then it would just go all around the building on both sides. Let's look at the South Tower in comparison to a known controlled demolition on the left. Is there any similarity? Enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition? I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was. A crackling explosive. Another loud boom at the upper floors. Then there was a series of smaller explosions which appeared to go completely around the building at the upper floors. And another loud earth-shattering blast with large fireball which blew out more debris. The lower level of the building, you know, like when they demolish a building, that's what I thought I saw. Did you see any flashes? I said, yes. I thought it was just me. He said, no, I saw them too. Everybody, I think at this point, still thought these towers were blown up. So I was fully expecting anything else to blow up. You were there when the planes hit? I said, no, I was there when the building exploded. You mean when it fell down? No, when it exploded. Let's look at these additional witnesses.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the
planet probably.
Yeah, definitely secondary explosion.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower.
It just went ba-boom. It was like a bomb went off. And another explosion came right from it, just everyone flying.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
No, the first explosion, then there was a second explosion in the same building. There were 2 explosions.
Okay. Federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting.
There was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Then there was those secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses.
That the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Now, that's the first time we're hearing that. So 2 planes and explosives that were in the building. Is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point. That is
A huge explosion now, raining debris on all of us.
It's
sounded like gunfire, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden 3 big explosions.
About 50 consecutive bangs, and it fell down like a waterfall.
And we heard the noise associated with an implosion.
We heard a very loud blast, an explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse before us.
We heard a loud explosion, and at that point, building 2 was collapsing.
At that point, we heard a large boom. I looked up and just saw the building coming at us.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse?
To me, it sounded like an explosion.
There was another major explosion. The building itself, literally the top of it came down.
All of a sudden you hear explosion, and you could see the building starting to collapse.
Huge explosion that we all heard and felt. We understand now there has been a secondary explosion on Tower 2.
According to the Associated Press, another building that has either been attacked or exploded.
The tower, rather, that has collapsed, that we are told collapsed because of a third explosion.
And about an hour later after that, there was a huge explosion at the base of the South Tower. That's the One World Trade Center, and part of the building collapsed.
We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the Second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions.
And then you heard from far away, boom, boom.
And you heard the boom, 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 boom.
Floor by floor, it started popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Yeah,
if they were planned
yeah.
to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
From the corner, boom, 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 boom. Just like 20 straight hits. And as the bombs were going, people just started running. And I sat there and watched a few of them explode, and it just started going pop. It just started going boom, 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 boom. And he goes, how fast? I go, like firecrackers.
How many of these witnesses of explosions do you imagine were included in the final report in 2005 by NIST? Not one. They claim to have interviewed hundreds and hundreds of witnesses. Somehow they missed all these. NIST said, well, it couldn't have been a controlled demolition because it didn't start at the bottom, the explosions. Well, let's listen to one of the top controlled demolition companies, Mark Loiseau, Controlled Demolition, Inc.
You can go almost anywhere in the structure, and given the right circumstances, you can release all of that stored energy, converting it into what is called kinetic energy. That's energy in motion, and that's what brings the building down.
There's a controlled demolition top down right there. So NIST claims, well, the upper part of the building above the point of jet plane impacts drove the rest of the building down to the ground and then destroyed itself. There's a few problems with this theory, other than there being no evidence for it. It violates Newton's third law of motion. There's an equal and opposite destructive force. When two bodies collide with each other, the biggest and strongest one wins, right? It's pretty clear. It doesn't matter if you drop the Volkswagen onto the Mack truck. The lightest part of a structure cannot possibly destroy the heavier, cold, hard, intact structure down below, as if it's not even there. Remember, the lightest part is at the top, 3/8 inch thick steel at the top, getting heavier and heavier and heavier as you go down. At mid-height, we're talking 30 inches by 16 inches and 2 inches thick, and then heavier and heavier and heavier till we have almost solid steel at the base of the towers. So we're talking about a Volkswagen. They're saying a Volkswagen destroyed a Mack truck. Well, this theory comes from Zdenek Bazant from Chicago Northwestern University, who published a paper in the Journal of Engineering Mechanics that was submitted just 2 days after 9/11. It's extremely complex. It's called the crush down, crush up theory, as we just described. It remains as NIST's key theoretical support for their crush down, crush up theory. Let's look at it though, because there's a few problems here. The formulas are actually correct, but the input values are completely falsified. What do I mean? Well, first of all, the whole paper's so obfuscated that you can't hack it and figure out what's going on, even very, very experienced structural engineers. But it was hacked, and what did they find? They took out a whole story of columns, 12 feet high columns, 300 of them, removed instantly to allow for a false collapse or free fall of the upper section onto the lower section to develop a dynamic impact, which never would have occurred since those columns were there. They doubled the mass of the top beyond what was natural. They decreased the column strength below by 3 times. They decreased the velocity loss due to the law of conservation of momentum, and they eliminated the column reserve strength. These columns are 3 to 5 times stronger than they needed to be to hold this building up. So by the time you do all that, what you've done is you've rigged the equation 12 to 1 in favor of a collapse. This was actually done and submitted and approved by the Journal of Engineering Mechanics. In reality, what you have is a downward momentum would have been arrested, as David Chandler shows in his calculation. Actually, that's Tony Zamboti. David Chandler measured the data that shows from the videos that the building came down almost at near free fall, and the Besant theory actually shows it even coming down. Well, the slope is the same, but in reality, as that buckling would be occurring and bending stresses on those columns, there would be a resistance and a complete arresting of the downward impact, even with an impact of the downward movement, even with an impact load. So this has been refuted by engineers and submitted to the American Society of Civil Engineers, Journal of Engineering Mechanics, by Tony Zamboti and Richard Johns in 2014, along with another paper. But guess what? The errors are upheld by the American Society of Civil Engineers, who, by the way, were the main organization behind the FEMA report. They won't publish the correction of these errors. Why? They said it is out of scope. Wait a minute. How is it out of scope to point out errors, serious, grievous errors that were made by a previously published paper? So there's an ethics case going on with the American Society of Civil Engineers over the refusal to publish this paper right now. And that's pending. Also, tell me if you see any upper part of this building driving the rest of the building down. We call that the pile driver. Take a look here. The upper part's going down, but what's happening beneath it? Zoom in. Look at the lower red line. There's no downward movement until after this video stops. So for the first 2 or 3 seconds, the upper part of the building is destroying itself. It's like the Volkswagen that ran into the Mack truck. That's what's happening here. And we'll talk about what happens after that in a moment. Like the first responders said, stop. We have bands of explosions wrapping all the way around the building. Go and stop. In fact, NIST's theory is that the lightweight steel trusses, which have concrete floors, 4 and 8 inches thick floors, on top of them sagged due to the fires that we already saw were diminished at the time of the collapse, and thus pulled in on these columns. Well, the columns are pulling in. You can see that in this looped video in the corner here. They're all pulling in at once, at least on each side of this corner. The question is, what's pulling them in? To get an answer to that, we go back to the FEMA, who originally found something very important that NIST threw out of their report. Let's listen.
When the collapse finally starts, the antenna started just a little bit before the exterior of the building started. And that tells us that the core columns let go first.
Now, this is extremely important because NIST says the perimeter columns let go first. But the antenna, as you can see here, down, down, back, back, forward, forward, back, back, down, down, up, up. So you can see that that antenna is dropping at least 10 or 20 feet right there. This is a huge 400-foot tall antenna. So what does the antenna sit on? It sits on the hat truss. What does the hat truss sit on? It sits on the core columns. So first the core columns are failing, then the hat truss fails and the antenna descends. So the question is, what's pulling on the perimeter columns? Or, excuse me, on the floors to get the perimeter columns to pull in? Well, if the core columns are sacrificed a second early, then they pull on the core, on the lightweight steel trusses, and then that pulls on the perimeter columns. So that becomes a rational reason why these perimeter columns are pulling in, although this particular animation is not perfectly showing the perimeter columns bowing inward. But none of the photographs or videos show an upper section of the building driving the rest of the building. It's gone. In the first 4 seconds, it's completely gone. In fact, if it were there, what you'd see, you wouldn't see these remaining few inner core columns standing 6 seconds after the whole building has come down, more like 10 seconds, and then it begins to fall. And that is an explosive force on the side of it, which is causing that dust, that pulverized concrete dust, to fly off of it. But you can see the top end of this beam descending all the way through that cloud. Some people say the steel turned to dust. That's ludicrous. There's no steel dust in the powder that has been rigorously analyzed by numerous agencies and companies. So what is this? Is it a collapse or is it an explosion? It looks more like the eruption of the volcano under the Tongan Sea in March of 2009, with incredible upward, outward arching streamers, freely flying solid objects, and a geometry of fireworks. It doesn't look like a gravitational collapse to me. Let's jump to feature number 3. Is there a straight down, nearly symmetrical progression outside the building's footprint? Well, let's start with, the South Tower. It falls almost 22 degrees off of its axis. This is not symmetrical yet, but wait and see. So we have asymmetrical loading from this portion of the building that's falling off of its axis, loading on the structure below. We have asymmetrical damage from the fires. We have asymmetrical damage from the airplanes. Why then do we have complete symmetrical damage all the way down all four faces of this building. It's a complete non sequitur. It makes no sense. Let's zoom in on some of those explosions that you see here, rapidly advancing down the corner of the building, floor by floor, dozens of explosions going off right before your face. And yet we're told this is a gravitational collapse, which presumably would be going on 20 stories up above, because this is the leading corner. Here's another view of it on the lower right. What are you looking at? Traveling down the face of the building almost as fast as the freely falling structural sections, core and perimeter columns. And we'll get to the squibs, or those isolated explosive ejections, in a moment. But yes, this is symmetrical. It's 1,200 feet in diameter. There's only a 200-foot square building, but the debris is symmetrically arranged outside that footprint, destroying the winter gardens 600 feet away. Well outside the perimeter of the superblock, the World Trade Center, and almost all outside the perimeter of the North and the South Tower, as we'll see in a moment. Compare that to the nice, neat implosion of Building 7, a classic implosion, versus the very explosive event known as the World Trade Center Towers. And something else going on altogether in Building 6, where we'll see next week molten metal was seen dripping down the walls. Another partial implosion. By the way, if 100,000 tons of steel framing is distributed outside the footprint of these buildings, what's crushing the building? You say, oh, it's the concrete floors. We'll come back to that. Is there ejection of materials at the lower floors? Well, let's take a look. Here's thanks to Dylan Avery and the guys at Loose Change, 9/11, a film seen by 20 million people. We have these very clearly shown explosive ejections occurring 20, 40, even 60 stories down below what we're told is a gravitational collapse. Well, NIST is asked, and they finally admit in their very frequently asked questions published years later on their website, that these must be puffs of air. Well, you can see the building solids in many of them. If they were puffs of air, we were produced by that pile driver, which we saw doesn't even exist, but let's say it did, and it was pushing air down the hoistway and has to come out somewhere, right? Well, would it produce these engineered type ejections, violent and pinpoint, or in open office planning, would it fill those open offices uniformly with air pressure and then blow out all the windows or none of them, but not these highly focalized, pinpoint accurate ejections at geometrically precise configurations? Looking at the South Tower specifically, all at once, On the left side, the entire South Tower is being destroyed by multiple explosions, cutting the columns and beams inside of it, which is presumably what allows it to fall not in one chunk, but completely severed one column from another beam, as we'll see in a moment. These squibs are documented by physics teacher David Chandler. Let's listen.
Here I'm measuring the ejection velocity of a squib on the east face of the South Tower. At this angle there is foreshortening, but the calibration distance is foreshortened by the same proportion. Plotting horizontal position versus time, the slope indicates the ejection velocity, which is 67 meters per second, or 150 miles per hour.
150 miles per hour. This is explosive speeds, not air pressure. So we have 160 to 200 feet per second. Extraordinary. How fast is the building coming down? Well, we can time it. Let's do that. Here's on the left is the timer. On the right, an animation. 5 seconds. 8 seconds. 10 seconds. In a dozen seconds, both of the buildings are completely down to the ground. Now, you might have to think about this, but David Chandler's done the work once again for you. Let's get started there.
We are here tracking the motion of the roofline at 0.2 second intervals through approximately 32 meters or 8 stories. This graph shows the height of the roofline as a function of time. The analysis is simpler if we plot velocity as a function of time. On this kind of a graph, a straight line indicates constant acceleration. First note that there is a sudden onset of collapse, as the point we are tracking makes a sudden transition from being at rest to an approximately constant downward acceleration. The slope of the graph indicates that the acceleration is 6.31 meters per second squared downward, which is 64% of free fall.
The building is falling almost as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky. It's not decelerating when it hits buckling columns. It's accelerating straight down through them. 2/3 of free fall acceleration through what? Through an incredible density of steel inside the building and outside the building, as you see here. There's more steel than glass in the facade of this building. Those are 14-inch square steel tube columns that somehow had to have been removed. It's almost like this. You hold a 15-story section of this building up on one side over nothing but air with this giant crane. On the other side, the same weight of building held up over, say, 80,000 tons of structural steel resistance that's 5 times stronger than it needs to be to withhold that load. We're going to drop these both at once. What happens? Well, a 7th grader can tell you this. The one on the right falls at free fall. It falls as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky. The one on the left is going to hit that resistance and stop if it ever crushes any of it. And we've even vanished a whole story there, like Zdenek Bezant did in his crush down, crush up theory, to get a false start on a dynamic load impact. Let's look at it another way. Here's Massimo Mazzucco's New Pearl Harbor.
Something of this kind is what we should have seen when the top section of the towers collapsed onto the lower one. The upper and lower sections should have mutually destroyed each other until all the energy is dissipated and the system comes to a rest. Alternatively, as shown in this experiment with 2 towers made of snow, the top section could have fallen off to the side after the initial collapse. What could not have happened is this.
A little tiny chunk of the building can't possibly fall
and crush the entire structure below it.
This is such a simple, fundamental concept that architects and engineers were astonished in seeing it totally ignored by NIST.
This is high school physics, and our whole society is being led to believe that these fundamental laws of physics, hard science, don't apply anymore.
But they do, of course, and that's why we have additional peer-reviewed papers that, in this case, were published in the Journal of Protective Structures, questioning the whole NIST theory of collapse. And do we have the total shattering of the structural steel frame? Feature number 6 of controlled demolition. Well, the National Fire Protection Association Guide 921 for Fire and Explosion Investigation says, look for the effects of explosions, shrapnel effects, high-order damage, characterized by the shattering of the structure, producing small pulverized debris with the building completely demolished, debris thrown great distances. Well, that's exactly what we have at the World Trade Center towers, as you can see, with the individual columns broken up one from the other in their original 37.5-foot lengths, shipped and hauled away. Feature number 7 is their lateral ejection. Let's go back to the National Fire Protection Guide and let's see if there are additional effects of explosions. Blast pressure wave effects. Heavy structural steel pieces freely flying. Yes, freely flying. 300 to 600 feet in every direction away from the World Trade Center towers. Like this one here. Whoa, back to, forward to, back to, forward. What are we looking at here? That's a 45-degree angle. Gravity works how? Down. Something shot this 4-ton structural steel section laterally out, and then gravity begins to take over as it's about to hit World Trade Center 7 there and begin to go on its downward trajectory. Let's go back to physics teacher David Chandler.
Girders weighing several tons were found 600 feet from the base of the North Tower. How fast they were ejected depends on where they originated. If they came from high in the building, they were thrown outward at about 50 miles per hour. If they came from lower down, the speed had to be even greater. Gravity alone cannot account for such high lateral ejection speeds.
I'm here measuring the horizontal speed of what appears to be one or more wall units, which are being thrown northward from the North Tower. Because it was recorded by a handheld camera, I had to first stabilize the image. Then I did the measurements from the stabilized version of the video. Final result, 35 meters per second, which is 78 miles per hour.
Not only are these hurled 78 miles per hour, but they're trailing thick white smoke clouds, which we will dive into in part 3 of this 3-part series, 9/11 An Architect's Guide, when we get into the extreme heat.
Girders weighing several.
So there's enough energy here to hurl a 200-pound or fire a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles in each of these 4-ton structural steel sections. And there's hundreds and hundreds of them. Where's all this energy coming from? Feature 8, do we have pulverized concrete? Well, we're missing some floors here. In a gravitational collapse, we, like in Mexico, we have pancakes. We expect to see the debris from the building down at the bottom, but we only have a 3 or 4 story pile of twisted steel at the World Trade Center. Where are the concrete floors? There was 110 of them, each of them an acre in size. We don't see 50 of them. We don't see 10 of them. We don't even see 1 of them. What happened to the concrete? It is clearly missing. 90,000 tons of it. Oh, it's pulverized in midair. In all the photographs and videos, that's exactly what we're seeing. 100-micron particles forming an ash spread 3 square miles throughout lower Manhattan. And a 3-inch thick blanket of concrete powder. 30% of this dust is concrete. And a good percent of it is gypsum as well, even more. Let's go to the governor of New York.
And you see, and there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel. What happened to the concrete? The concrete was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust, powder, 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
You have 2 110-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big. The building collapsed to dust.
What I expected to see was nothing like what I actually did see at the time of my arrival at the site. There wasn't much that you could say, you could describe. Everything was dust and metal. There was no typewriters, there was no chairs, there was no nothing.
Well, there were lots of file cabinets, but we can't find but one of them. I'll show you that. But first, if 90,000 tons of concrete is pulverized and spread over 3 square miles, then we have to ask ourselves the question, what's crushing the building? Because we're told the building was crushed. Well, it wasn't the steel. 98% of that is outside the footprint of the building. It's not the concrete. 99% of that is outside the footprint of the building and all over lower Manhattan. This is 2/3 the weight of the building. There's hardly anything left to crush the building. How many different ways can we rip the official narrative, the fraud of NIST, apart? Here's the file cabinet that they found. It survived only because it was in the basement. It was from an ice cream store. There must have been 10,000 filing cabinets. Where are they? And how about the people?
In April 2006, New Yorkers were distressed to learn that bone fragments, human remains from 9/11, had been found on the roof of the nearby Deutsche Bank building.
And how, in God's name, did those fragments get there?
And bone fragments less than a centimeter long. How could they be so small?
Wait a minute. We have 700 bone fragments found on top of this building, the Deutsche Bank building, a half an inch long. Well, they didn't come from the people in this airplane because those ejections were sent out this way. They didn't come from the people from this airplane that hit the North Tower because those ejections were blocked from the Deutsche Bank building by the South Tower. Many of these were from the firefighters, as you can see by the red, the bone fragments seen in red there, are the firefighters. And the firefighters weren't even on the scene at the time of the plane impacts, of course. There are a total of 2,749 victims, the World Trade Center, but only 300 whole bodies were found. 20,000 pieces of bodies were found altogether. 6,000 of them were small enough to fit into a test tube. 200 pieces were matched to one single person. And yet, more than 1,150 victims remain completely unaccounted for still today. They were vaporized. How can that possibly be explained? And those body parts were found 800 feet away from the towers, many of them. We'd expect them to be trapped between floors and certainly badly mangled. But they weren't. They were vaporized. And those pieces, not vaporized, how did they get 800 feet from each of the towers? So what we're seeing so far is 8 key features, some very uncharacteristic features too, of course, of controlled demolition. This is direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire does not create these features, any of them, let alone all of them, especially these fires, which are diminished at the time of the collapse, indicating that they're cooler by the thick black smoke. With additional testimony dug up again by Graham McQueen, the 118 original witnesses now expands to 156 in his latest 2015 report. Witnesses of explosions. Well, there's another witness of explosion, which turns out to be pretty important. This is the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, 20 miles north of New York, in Palisades. FEMA and NIST relied upon these reports. So let's look at them very carefully, because there's 4 different events. The first couple of events are claimed to be due to the plane impacts, because the seismic event occurs near the time of the plane impacts. Well, let's go into it. The second impact at the South Tower produces a 0.7 magnitude. The first impact, a 0.9 magnitude at the North Tower. But we have some problems here. The seismic event occurs at 8:46 and 26 seconds. But the plane impacts don't happen for 14 seconds later in the North Tower. So how can the plane impact cause the seismic event? Well, NIST has an answer for this. It's not going to rely on the NTSB radar, which the 9/11 Commission relied on, which is accurate to within a second, by the way. It's going to analyze, NIST says they analyze the videos, and they think the plane impacted 10 seconds earlier. Wow, okay. And you're still 4 seconds off. What do you do then? You go back to Columbia University and get them to move their whole seismic event back 3 seconds in a privately contracted report that we cannot even see. They will not release it as to the reasons why all of a sudden you're moving your whole data back 3 seconds. Let's go to the second plane impact in the South Tower. Seismic event occurs at 9:02 and 54 seconds. But the plane doesn't impact, again, for 17 seconds later. Well, how's NIST going to deal with this one? Oh, we analyzed the videos and we came up with the reality. The plane impact isn't didn't happen according to the NTSB radar, which is accurate to within 1 second. It happened 12 seconds earlier. So what are you going to do? You're still 5 seconds off. Oh, same report, same movement of the event, same 3 seconds. They move this one back too. Can't get that report. Well, what might have caused an explosion before the planes impacted the buildings? We go to Mike Picaro in the basement. It says the whole building seemed to shake and there was a loud explosion. The two ascended the stairs to the sea level of the basement. They found the machine shop gone. Nothing there but rubble, Mike said. We're talking about a 50-ton hydraulic press gone. They made their way to the parking structure, but found that it too was gone. Parking structure, that's severe damage. We're talking about steel and concrete fire door that weighed 300 pounds, wrinkled up like a piece of aluminum foil lying on the ground. A bomb had gone off in the building. Well, that is reported by several others, 14 others who were with Willie Rodriguez in the basement, and others as well. Willie was a janitor who heard an explosion before the plane hit the towers. Listen carefully. Wow. Come on, Willie. All right. I know he's going to talk. Willie's never had a problem talking. Well, not today. I'll just make a note of that and make sure he talks for you next time. What does Willie say? He says a bomb went off in the basement before the plane hit, and then the plane hit up above. He felt the floor beneath him rise up. He knows when he worked there for 20 years. He knows the explosion when he hears it. And then there's two other witnesses here that I encourage you to look on YouTube for this video, this webinar, part 2 of 9/11, an Architect's Guide, about this far away into the webinar. You'll hear these two witnesses. And then next month, we'll get this working for you. I can start to hear him. And then he doesn't want to. Oh, he sure doesn't. Well, we go to Andre Rousseau, applied geophysics expert, author of more than 50 published papers on progressive mechanical waves and geology. In 2012, he does an analysis of these seismic events. He finds that the frequency of the Raleigh waves, the primary waves that come in, were attributed by LDEO to the impacts of the planes, but they're only on the order of 1 hertz in frequency. But aircraft crash impacts have much higher frequencies, above 10 hertz and often up to around 100, 2 orders of magnitude higher. Oh, cute. And these frequencies were filtered out by the 0.6 to 0.5 hertz bandpass filters used by LDEO. There we go. The seismic equipment is designed to detect seismic events, which include explosions, by the way, not airplane crashes. So, hold on a second. We need to synchronize our fascinating. I haven't seen this happen before. I'm just going to come back to slide 417 after we bring up our PowerPoint again. And let's see if we can, here we go. Now they're synchronized. That helps me out. Hey, let's go to the, he says they're not from plane impacts. The actual waves generated by the crash had to have been even deadened before hitting the ground. The seismic shock of the planes hitting the towers, much less couldn't have traveled 20 miles north. So then there is also the seismic signals near the time of the collapse. In the case of the first tower, the first tower to collapse, which was the south tower, we have a 2.1 magnitude event. In the case of the north tower, a 2.3 magnitude event. Now, NIST attributes these events to the time of the collapse. Okay, let's test that theory, because we have the surface waves hitting at 10:28 and 31 seconds. All right. Well, the tower starts its descent 9 seconds earlier, and the first debris doesn't even strike the pavement until 1 second later. But the heaviest debris, which would be presumably responsible for the greatest seismic event or activity, doesn't even strike the pavement for 4 seconds later. So what does NIST do with this discrepancy? Once again, they go back to LDEO, Columbia University, and get them to revise their scientific data back 3 seconds to align with their narrative of the situation. In a privately funded or private contract, which we cannot see the report of. Completely ignoring the primary wave that comes in earlier. Primary waves are those that go through the rock, the bedrock. So they go a lot faster, and they get there. They get there earlier. And this is all compensated for the distance away and everything. And the shear waves come a little later, all of which is 4 seconds before the tower even starts descending, in the case of the primary wave. So what can account for those waves coming even before the tower's descent? Well, do you remember those witnesses of explosions before the tower collapsed? Lots of them. Well, there's another one, and there's two more. Cameras that are on tripods. 6 and 10 seconds before the tower starts its descent, these cameras are shaking. Let's look at this one first. At the North Tower. So you can see it's steady here. There's the shake. That's not me. I'm not shaking it. And then the tower descends 6 seconds later, just like the firefighters described. Again, on the top of a nearby building. Etienne Soiree film, 24 hours. There's a shake right there. The camera's shaken, and 10 seconds later, in this case, after a massive ejection of smoke out of the top, the tower, the upper half of the tower is being liquefied. The structure basically liquefied. How about the South Tower? 2.1 magnitude event occurring at 8:59 and 04 seconds. But the start of the seismic event is happening 5 seconds after the start of the tower's collapse. The first debris doesn't even hit the pavement until 7 seconds after the seismic event. So how can it cause the seismic event? Well, NIST has an answer to this too. For the fourth time in a row, they have paid Columbia University to move their data back 3 seconds to coincide with their fraudulent narrative. What could have caused that seismic event? Well, one thing we should be looking at is additional cameras. This work has been done, by the way, by Graham McQueen in 2009. And 3 seconds before the start of the tower's collapse, at the beginning of a more well-defined set of shear waves to the right of the yellow marker, we have the camera shaking. This one's more subtle. New York 1 shaking 3 seconds prior. And watch carefully. There's the shake. And 3 seconds later, the tower's coming down. So I encourage you to look into this more carefully. With Graham McQueen's 2009 work. I'll show you that in a second. The official narrative says the seismic signals are due to debris hitting the ground, but let's look at this another way. Debris is not hitting the ground, it's hitting concrete floors and gypsum wall boards. The concrete floors and the gypsum walls is pulverized to dust. There's no seismic component at all from pulverized dust. We saw no large chunks of concrete. The steel has been shattered to its individual wall units, and they're only 4 to 8 tons each. That's not going to produce a seismic event 20 miles north. And they don't hit the ground all at once, but over a period of 15 seconds. And they're not hitting the ground at all. They're hitting a 7-story concrete basement structure, which surely would be dampening the seismic component even more. And they're equally distributed over this entire superblock. It's not like the building came down into its own footprint, causing a massive seismic event. And by the way, here we have nearly identical buildings, and as you can see, nearly identical collapses, yet producing extremely different seismic events. One's 1.6 times greater, the North Tower. See, this is on the logarithmic scale. So the difference between 2.1 magnitude seismic event and 2.3 is 1.5 times larger. So what can produce that? So Andre Rousseau says identical buildings and identical collapses can't possibly produce seismic events of extremely different energy releases. So all of this is documented, or at least summarized, in point TT7 of the Best Evidence Panel, Consensus 9/11 by Elizabeth Woodworth and David Ray Griffin. An extraordinary expose of a lot of the evidence that the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth aren't even looking at because it's outside of our scope of expertise of these buildings. Some say, oh, the Seattle Kingdom had a 2.3 magnitude. The towers should have been much greater magnitude. Well, the Seattle Kingdom has a 25,000 ton concrete roof that impacts the ground virtually at once. So you can't compare apples to oranges here, versus the North Tower, as we saw, over a 1,400 foot diameter around each of these towers. And the concrete's not even a component. So this is the work that you need to be looking at to go deeper into the seismic evidence. How about the data from the FEMA and NIST reports? The NIST report received $20 million to produce it. They did. And they were tasked by Congress to determine how and why World Trade Center 1 and 2 collapsed. But they had their own objective, which is hidden in footnote 13 on page 82. The focus of our investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse. What? It doesn't actually include the structural behavior of the towers after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached. Wait a minute. You spent $20 million in 3 years to study the initiation of collapse? 1,000 pages modeling the airplanes? 100 pages of life safety issues and modeling? Computer modeling? 42 sub-reports? And only half a page on the events following collapse initiation? The actual collapse? Okay. What does that half page say? Structure below the level of collapse initiation offered minimal resistance. The large building mass far exceeded the capacity of the intact structure below it to absorb it. Came down essentially in free fall. Floors below were unable to arrest the moving mass. This is pure speculation. There's no supporting calculations or analysis whatsoever. Structural engineers are fully capable of doing this. Why would NIST have stopped at the collapse initiation? Had they gone any further, they would have had to have accounted for all of this evidence that we've been looking at today and that we will be looking at in part 3 of this series in next week's webinar. Should have been titled Final Report on the Initiation of Collapse. We wrote to them and said, you have some problems with this. You can do requests for correction with agencies like this when they produce fraudulent reports like this. And they write back and say, we were unable to provide a full explanation of the collapse of the Twin Towers. Yeah, they are unable to provide no analysis whatsoever. Did they follow the NFPA 921? Well, let's see. They found no corroborating evidence to suggest that where explosives were used. Well, did you look? Nope, they finally admit NIST did not test for the presence of explosive residue. You can't find what you will not look for. How about other experts? Experts who may not have a stake with financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion. Experts who signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of these 3 towers. Experts like William Rice, one of 100 structural engineers who have done just that, staking their reputation, calling out the fraud. The prevailing theory would have us believe that each of the Twin Towers inexplicably collapsed upon itself while crushing all 287 massive columns on each floor while maintaining a near free fall acceleration, as if the 80,000 or more tons of supporting structure steel framework underneath didn't even exist. Structural engineers like David Scott. Near free fall collapse violates laws of physics. Fire protection engineers like Scott Granger. All 3 collapses were very uniform in nature. Natural collapses, due to unplanned events, are not uniform. Van Romero, explosives expert, says explosive devices caused the collapse of both towers. It's too methodical to be a chance of airplanes colliding with the structures. After the airplanes hit the World Trade Center, there were some explosive devices inside the building that caused the collapse. Well, he recanted this after hearing about it, I'm sure, from the federal government, who supplies most of the grants that pays for New Mexico Tech and their explosives work and investigations and research. Also, Mathis Levy, who before joining the FEMA team had this to say.
We've seen many of the managed demolitions where they implode a building and they cause it essentially to fall vertically because they cause all of the vertical columns to fail simultaneously. That's exactly what it looked like, and that's what happened.
Wow. And completely retracted that, as did Ronald Hamburger, retracting this after he joined the FEMA team. It appeared to me that charges had been placed in the building. Upon learning that no bombs had been detonated, I was very surprised. Well, we've seen all kinds of evidence today of bombs being detonated. What happened to his testimony? And this one, Mike Taylor, National Association of Demolition Contractors. The collapse of World Trade Center towers looked like a classic controlled demolition. The collapse of towers mirrored the strategy used by demolition experts. Explosives are placed not just on the lower floors, but also on several consecutive floors, about a third of the way up the building. It cascaded down like an implosion. Well, some have held their ground, like Andre Rousseau. Even if the plane impacts and the fall of the debris from the towers onto the ground could have generated seismic waves, their magnitude would have been insufficient to be recorded 20 miles north and should have been very similar in the two cases to one another, but they were not. Controlled demolitions confirmed and demonstrated. What about the evidence? The evidence in a crime scene. Surely it was preserved. Here's Abul Hasan Astani Azal, a structural engineer with unlimited access to the net while it was there, the steel in the landfill. He had a National Science Foundation grant. Let's listen to him.
After 9/11, we realized that Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has sent all the steel that we need to study. That's why I'm here to study steel. Has sent all the steel to recycling plant to go to China for recycling. For what? For 15 cents a pound. Just nothing. And all the evidence of steel went to melting pot.
After 9/11, a law was passed requiring that such materials be saved for study.
Too little, too late, though. That's for sure. All the evidence of the steel went to the melting pot to China for recycling, prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough and scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't, and easily the largest and most perplexing structural failures in history. Up to 400 truckloads a day removed all but a few hundred pieces of steel, effectively scrubbing it. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene, which is one of the final reasons today we'll be looking at the hypotheses supported of controlled demolition. At least that's my perspective. I'd like to know what yours is. We've shown today 8 key characteristic and some very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition. Direct evidence of destruction with explosives, not by fires. Fire doesn't create any of these features, let alone all of them. With additional circumstantial corroborative evidence here, we believe that this is proof of controlled demolition, which is why we're asking you to get involved. And Andy can tell you how you might ask some questions and let us know what you think also of the webinar. Andy.
Absolutely. We do want to hear it. Right now, I only have one question. I'd like to get a
few more if that's possible. So please submit any questions that you might have in the same input form, and we'll do our best to answer them. In the meantime, we're going to talk about some of the ways that you can get involved. If now that you're informed, you agree that this evidence is quite compelling and warrants a new investigation.
And while you're there, please subscribe to our weekly, every other week really, newsletter. So you can get the latest evidence that we are coming up with and the packages we're packaging it with, the efforts we're making toward getting a real investigation. Don't be left out. It takes 2 minutes to put your name and your email in there. You can get informed on our website also. We have lots of evidence for you, a lot more than we've been able to give you today, in fact. And sign the petition while you're there. Support the 3,000 architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. If you're not one yourself, we have 20,000 others supporting them. And you can do that right here on our website. And while you're there, support us, donate. We have 6 employees who are working very, very hard to get this information out to the architects, the engineers, the elected representatives, the media, and the general public. And we do a lot to make that happen, like going around to structural engineering and architecture conferences and educating them. And we're a 501c3 nonprofit organization, so your donation is tax deductible, and we're hurting. So we need your support right now more than ever. You can become a member as well. You can make your gift here right on our website. But becoming a member and joining the family of AE 9/11 Truth as a sustaining supporter is really important for us. That allows us to do the regular work in addition to the projects that we do. And if you can't do any of that, please volunteer with us with your time and your skills. Andy, what are some of the opportunities there?
Absolutely. We got a lot of people who are increasingly becoming interested as they see other things happening out in this world, and they realize how important this issue is. To me, it's the single most important issue facing us right now, because I think a lot of the stuff that we're dealing with come off of what happened on September 11th and what didn't happen, which was an acknowledgement of the truth and the fact that these buildings were brought down with explosives. And there's a number of ways that you can get involved here if you want to be involved with our volunteer family, work that you can do if you're an introverted person or an extroverted person. You want to be on the phone. You want to call some of these professors once these colleges open up again. We certainly will need that help. You want to get involved in helping us with some of our congressional outreach activities. We have a guy who was doing outreach to presidential candidates out in Iowa. Amazing work. It was like a full-time job for him. He was retired, but he would go out there and hand our materials to each person that wanted to become president, and I got some great stories from him. You can obviously help out in other ways through verifications, translations team, data collection. Always need people helping out with that. And sometimes the volunteers have ideas of their own as well that we want to hear. But the first step towards doing that is go to ae911truth.org. You fill out a very quick form. We get back in touch with you and figure out where you're going to fit best. It's usually where you think you're going to fit best. And we'll get you to work. And it's that little bit of work each week that you do that really helps us do some of the awesome things that are happening now. So please consider it.
Yep, you can see all the teams we have, and many of them are needing you right now. But if you work alone, you can do things on your own, such as send out our materials and our website to your local elected representatives, television, radio, newspaper folks. There's a lot of important work that can be done. Tell everybody you know about this screen, the DVD that I'm going to show you a piece of in a minute. So share the brochures one-on-one. You can get 100 brochures for $10 in our store. Share the report with structural engineers and civil engineers, even architects, the finite element modeling of World Trade Center 7. Final report is done. Leroy Hulsey found that this building Building 7 could not have come down by fire. The University of Alaska produced this 130-page, 4-year report and completely pulled the rug out from underneath NIST's fraudulent Building 7 theory as well, which is one of the reasons we're going to Congress with the Bobby McIlvaine Act. Andy, what about that one?
Yes, this is the Bobby McIlvaine World Trade Center Investigation Act. You know, for a number of years, we asked Congress to launch a new investigation. It was pretty broad ask on them, so we narrowed it down. We have this draft legislation now. Most of the work is done for them. We just need a congressman to step forward, acknowledge how important this issue is, and introduce this. And of course, a few other members of Congress to pass it. But the work starts with you. Now, what this would do is it creates a select committee. It can be passed in either house of the legislature, and it would do exactly what we've been asking Congress to do for years: investigate this information, not just have NIST go before them and give them a bunch of talking points, but actually look into the evidence that Richard has presented here today. It's written in that way that they would have to if this gets passed. So obviously nobody in Congress does anything unless they hear from their constituents that they want them to do that. That's where you get involved. It can be as simple as writing a letter to your member of Congress. If you don't have time to write a full letter, or you don't know what you should write, good news is you can go to ae911truth.org/justice. There's a letter already written for you. All you got to do is put your information in, and it will automatically send it to your representatives. We have a action going on right now. It's more regarding our request for correction that was submitted to NIST, but obviously sometimes the Bobby McIlvaine Act will come up as well in these conversations, but you can contact us at Congress at ae911truth.org and find out a little bit more about it. The best first step is just go to your congressman's website, say you want to request a meeting with yourself and the member of Congress or a staffer, along with representatives of AE911 Truth over the phone, because that's the only kinds of meetings that they're doing these days. But it's great because it provides us access to them more. But you say you want the meeting over the phone, you let us know that you did it, and we will follow it and assist you in getting this meeting to happen. So please consider doing that, because we've done a number of them right now, and we want to keep them going. We actually enjoy doing these. But it can be focused on the request for correction. We also talk about the Bobby McIlvaine Act, which is so important. It's named after Bobby. He died on September 11th from an explosion in the North Tower lobby. And obviously we have to get justice for him and for his father, who has worked with us for a number of years. So please get involved, and you can learn more about it at ae911truth.org/justice.
Awesome. And just know that we've also submitted 60 exhibits of this evidence to the U.S. attorney, who has agreed to comply with the law requiring him to hand it to a special grand jury. And we've now filed a mandamus lawsuit to force him to prove that he has done just that. So stand by for results there. We've also sued the FBI because they did not turn over the evidence that we have given them over the last 10 years to Congress, which Congress required them to do in the 2015 9/11 Review Commission, not the commission report. Stand by for that. And take a look here. Couple of minutes of the best documentary on the subject. 9/11 explosive evidence. Experts speak out. 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out the evidence. Take a look.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy. This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
Yeah, and you can pick up this. Hold on one second. There we go. You can pick up this incredible 1-hour version free on YouTube. The 1.5-hour version is exceptional. I recommend you get it in our store, DVD. And it includes extended interviews with these experts too. The second DVD, really, really good stuff. You can download the 50-page booklet, Beyond Misinformation. It's all about the fraudulent NIST cover-up and the evidence which supports the theory of controlled demolition. It's very nicely made also. You can get it for, I think, $10. And then the 2.5-hour version of this, we include all 3 buildings in one presentation. 2-hour. 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, also in our store, free on YouTube as well. And PBS version, Solving the Mystery, Building 7, narrated by Ed Asner, 15 minutes, just 15 minutes on Building 7. Real quick way to get people involved. It's free on YouTube. And hey, we got questions, Andy. Is that a fact?
Yep, we have one question. I'm going to ask you to comment on something after you answer it. But the question says, NIST said the Twin Towers came down essentially in free fall because the potential energy released by the downward movement of the large building mass far exceeded the capacity of the intact structure below to absorb that energy through energy of deformation. Isn't it true that the energy of deformation could also be called resistance? Isn't it true that below the initiation point in the North Tower that there would be far more resistance energy than the energy falling on those 95 floors of resistance energy below? Therefore, I don't care how much energy those top floors had because they can't do any work if those floors are falling freely. Any comments?
Yeah, this is an exceptional point. And we made the observation in this webinar that both of these towers are collapsing at near free fall acceleration. Now, if they are falling virtually at free fall, they're not slowing down, they're accelerating, which means they're getting faster and faster and faster every second. Their speed is accelerating, which means that the steel is not providing hardly any resistance. Only the steel has lost all but 10% of the resistance. Well, as we discovered last week, steel columns, when they buckle, even when they buckle, they provide a minimum of 25% of their capacity to resist the structure. They don't crumple like a straw in a cup of soda when you hammer it. It's not like that. That's not how steel behaves. So if it's providing a minimum of 25% of its capability, then that would provide 25%, not 10%, assuming all the steel beams were buckling at once, which is outrageous assumption in and of itself, that they would still provide 25% of the resistance needed. They would slow down the free fall of the collapse of that building. So the fact that the building is free falling is, yes, absolutely indicative that these columns are doing hardly any work. They've lost all but 10% of their capacity. So it makes no sense. Now, there's a part of this I didn't understand. Isn't it true that the energy of deformation could also be called resistance? Yes, if columns are deforming, then they're providing resistance during that deformation, and up to 25% or more, minimum of 25% and more. Isn't it true that below the initiation of failure in the North Tower, that there would be far more resistive energy than the energy falling on those 95 floors? Yeah, we covered that. Therefore, you, the questioner, don't care how much energy those top floors had. It doesn't matter, actually, because they can't do any work if those floors are falling freely. And that's absolutely true. A free fall means no structure. NIST actually, Shyam Sunder of NIST, the project leader of this whole report, said free fall would mean that there'd be no structure underneath. And they said that when they were denying the free fall of Building 7. Before they were publicly embarrassed, that is, in a press conference by members of AE 9/11 Truth, which confronted them and said, this is easily observable and measurable, the free fall of this building, and you're not dealing with it. They then came back in their final report and admitted the free fall of Building 7, but they do not acknowledge the implications of that free fall, which is that the structure had to go somewhere. Where the hell did it go? Did it just get transformed into cheese all of a sudden? No, this is what controlled demolitions do. They impose 45-degree cuts on structural steel columns so that, and then they use a kicker charge to kick the top one off the bottom one so that it falls without banging on it. So that allows, and they do that on all the columns at once, so the building can fall at or near free fall acceleration. And then the impacting energy of the building is used to further destroy remaining structure that it wasn't destroyed by explosives. Andy, you have any more thoughts on that one?
I think you pretty much thoroughly went through all of that. And it's another great comment, question from our audience here. And I just want to make sure we mention today that we have an article on our site right now that highlights this, but short version of new documentary 7 begins airing today on PBS. Of course, this is the short version, 5-minute version of Dylan Avery's film that'll be released. We're looking at in the fall, but this is very exciting. I actually, during the webinar, took a call from somebody who had called us very excited about this and said that we have validated the last 20 or so years of his life, because he's been talking to a lot of people about this and to get this kind of mainstream coverage. And it was also covered on Fox News Radio, I believe it was, the excitement around this. So can you just comment on that for our audience?
Yeah. The excitement of having Dylan Avery involved, who created Loose Change, seen 20 million times. He's since created several award-winning films. One was Black and Blue, about police abuse in New York. He has taken it upon himself, in partnership with us, to create a film about the major university study by the University of Alaska, Professor Leroy Halsey and his team of PhD engineers, who have concluded that the NIST report is, well, the only way you could take their conclusions is to agree that the NIST report is fraudulent. They pulled the rug out from underneath. They said the fire could not have brought that building down. The NIST assumptions were erroneous, and they had to take out several key structural components that would have kept this building from ever collapsing, in order to try to get it to collapse. And that its collapse doesn't even look like the collapse of the video. That is to say, their computer modeling analysis. Well, the University of Alaska did their own computer modeling analysis. And guess what? When they take out all 80 columns of Building 7, it falls exactly like the video shows that it falls. And it's pretty extraordinary. Well, a film is being made of this, and a 5-minute version of that film, starting today, is being shown on PBS to 9 million viewers over the next 3 months. And that's guaranteed through Nielsen ratings reports. So it's very exciting for us, because we're getting the report out there. We're getting Leroy Halsey's name. We're getting the structural engineers that we're working with on our team called Project Due Diligence, which is doing our due diligence to wake up the structural engineers around the country. And we've already gotten some, as Andy mentioned, some Fox News coverage of this. So I hope this will break the dam open. Everything we do has an opportunity to do just that. Maybe people are, listening now. They've been betrayed 6 ways from Sunday over the last 3 months by elements in our government. And This of course, 9/11 is yet another false flag operation in the long line of false flag operations that are designed to manipulate the American people to go to war. And we've got to do something about that. That's one of the many reasons. Of course, it's destroyed our economy. A $6.5 trillion global war on terror just decimated our civil liberties with the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012. So we've got a long way to go for justice. And that's what AE 9/11 Truth is ultimately really about. What do you think, Andy?
Absolutely. And I just want to congratulate Dylan Avery and all the people, either on our staff or otherwise, who have helped with this project and getting it out there. Great job on that. So that's all I got to say. Thank you, everybody, and I'll see you next week.
Yeah, because guess what's happening? Next week, we are going to be all over part 3, the Twin Towers in extreme heat, Thursday, 1 o'clock Pacific, 1 week from today. High-rise fires, we'll look in more depth into those. Pyroclastic-like clouds, incredible heat, unexplained by jet fuel, of course, or office fires. Molten steel and iron, creating temperatures 2,800 degrees minimum, and 4,000 degree temperatures documented as well. And iron microspheres throughout the World Trade Center, dust, evidence of molten iron, unaccountable by the official story. And thermite and nanothermite as a source for all of that. Very well documented. Come back next week and we will look for you. And then next month, guess what? We start all over again in July, first week of July, with the Building 7, 47-story skyscraper that collapsed into its own footprint in the afternoon of 9/11. You'll find out why. Thanks, everybody, and thanks, Andy. Bye for now.